as I'm telling you, this is the poor man's concern, the last person's concern to be free from hunger. Now, any group working with anything, if they don't ensure food security and the right to food, they can't proceed.
Right to Food campaign, along with it's a campaign, I must say that this is something wonderfully working in my country. More than 500 organizations, big and small, local and district level, sometimes state level, sometimes national level organizations, all are with diverse ideologies, with different opinions, and with, even though they have n number of differences on different issues, but on the question of right to food, this is a non-negotiable. We all came together and we are fighting to ensure right to food.
What it has given is completely unique, actually. Yeah. Even that one single order on the midday meal, and it's one of 50 orders, is actually, I calculated once that it was more than the budget of all development assistance, all NGOs, etc. together. That one order actually gave more to the poor in a direct sense than everything that everybody else is doing.
Everybody who dies from hunger on this planet is assassinated.
Well, there have of course been for a long time demands for various aspects of the right to food, but there was a big departure in 2001. And essentially what happened is that there was a drought in Rajasthan and reports of hardship there, which again does happen from time to time in some part of the country or the other. But what was new in that year is that at the same time as there was drought in large parts of the country and people suffering from hardship and hunger, there were also gigantic stocks of food accumulating in the warehouses of the government. At one point it was as much as 70 million tons of food lying in the warehouses and not being utilized. And that of course created a public outcry. There were also around the same time reports of starvation deaths from various states like Orissa. And that is the context in which a petition was submitted to the Supreme Court saying that this situation is unacceptable and that the state has a duty to protect people from hunger, and demanding that these food stocks should be used to provide different kinds of food assistance to people, like food for work or midday meals for children in primary schools and so on. Actually what happened is that when this petition was submitted, and by the way we didn't expect it to be taken seriously, but it was in fact taken quite seriously by the Supreme Court, partly because it coincided with these news of starvation deaths. So what the Supreme Court did is it asked the state governments and the central government, what are you doing to protect people from hunger? And most of the state governments submitted long affidavits saying that, we have a program for child nutrition, we have a program for pension for old age people, we have a program for subsidized grain through the public distribution system, we have a food for work program, and so on and so forth. And therefore there's no reason why anybody in our state should be hungry. And of course, this was hard to believe, so the Supreme Court told the state governments, this was 28 November 2001, basically told the state governments that whatever you claim that you're already doing, at least do that and do that properly, so that all these nutrition-related schemes effectively became legal entitlements.
So the Supreme Court actually did something very unusual. It said that, okay, the government has mentioned these 8 or 9 programs. From today, they're no longer programs. In a sense, they become entitlements, they become rights, because the government cannot withdraw them. It can only expand and enhance them, but it cannot withdraw them.
In addition to that, in the case of midday meals in primary schools, there was a so-called scheme of midday meals, which in fact consisted of giving monthly dry rations of food grain to children. For example, if a child attended at least 80% of the time, then they would get 3 kilos of grain every month for free. So the Supreme Court said that in the case of that particular scheme, instead of giving dry rations, the government should give cooked midday meals in the primary schools. That was a big step forward compared to what existed already. So that is what actually that particular part of the order of 28th of November 2001, gave a big boost to this campaign for the right to food, because it became clear that these orders, and in particular the order on midday meals in primary schools, which created a lot of interest, would not be implemented unless some kind of public pressure was built around the Supreme Court orders. So this is what happened, that for 2 or 3 years after that order, there was a growing campaign all over the country to use these orders to demand improvement and expansion in these nutrition programs, with a particular focus initially on the midday meal program, which was so interesting. Not only, the one reason why it created so much interest is that it's not just a nutrition program, but it's a very beautiful multi-purpose program which also boosts school attendance because it attracts the children to school. It's also a socialization program because the children learn to sit together and share a meal. It provides employment to millions of women who are now employed as cooks in primary schools. So there was a lot of interest in that program.
Midday meal scheme in India is in itself is a revolutionary thing. Relief feeling of a mother, the women who do anything and everything to see that at least a one-time meal should be given to her child. It's a big relief for the women of this country, and she is sure that I am sure that my child will get a meal at school, so I can go for work. I can take care of some other things. I need not take my child along with me for work.
Because of constructive and patient efforts to improve the program, it in fact became one of the best programs of the Indian government. And today if you walk into a primary school or in almost any Indian village, you will find that food is being provided to the children, and food of, I would not say satisfactory quality, but certainly better than what many of these schools get at home. There's a big difference between the situation that exists today and what was there before. Before that order, there were schemes that were basically coming from the top and that the government implemented basically as, according to their own will. There was no possibility of people claiming any of these entitlements as a matter of right. But now, because of the Supreme Court orders, people can claim these the benefits of these schemes as a matter of right. So midday meal was the scheme that created most interest initially, but of course the same principles apply to other schemes as well. And quite soon after that, there were similar orders concerned, for example, with the Integrated Child Development Services, the ICDS program, which is a program of health, nutrition and preschool education for children under the age of 6 years. And it's well known, of course, that that is the crucial age group as far as nutrition is concerned, because if you are undernourished by the age of 6 years, it's very difficult after that to repair that damage. So that is really the crucial age group. So there is a scheme in India called Integrated Child Development Services, which aims to provide nutrition, health and preschool education services to these children. But again, before these orders, it was not taken very seriously, it was very patchy, and it didn't have adequate financial and human resources. I think one reason for that is that it was nobody's priority. It's very difficult in India to get attention and political commitment to programs for children, unfortunately, and particularly for underprivileged children, because these children are twice removed from the levels of power. Firstly, they belong to underprivileged households, and then within the households, in any case, they have no voice, so they're really completely marginalized. So that program ICDS was not getting much attention, and the quality therefore was quite low in most states, with a few exceptions like Kerala and Tamil Nadu. But after the Supreme Courts came saying that no, these ICDS centers through which children are taken care of, they are called Anganwadis. It's like a creche, it's like a neighborhood creche. There has to be an Anganwadi in every village, and all the children below the age of 6 years have to receive all these ICDS services, and also there are some quality norms that have been introduced. So that pressure that again came not only from the orders per se, but from a combination of the Supreme Court orders and the public campaigns that built around these orders, that led to a very big change in the quality of the program, and certainly a massive increase in the allocations for these programs. Now, in the case of ICDS, I think there's still a very long way to go in achieving adequate standards of quality, but at least there is an interest in the program, it's in focus, it's getting financial support, and one can hope that within a few years it will be as successful as the midday meal program today. Today the midday meal program in primary schools covers probably around 120 million children. So every day 120 million children in India get a nutritious meal at the cost of the government. So it's by far the biggest feeding program in the world. And ICDS must be maybe half of that, but still fairly large numbers. Yeah.
लोग काम के नाम पर हाथों में झुंझुना पकड़ने को तैयार नहीं थे और इसीलिए रोजगार गारंटी कानून बनवाने के लिए देशव्यापी अभियान थमा नहीं बल्कि और तेज होता गया।
From the beginning in this Supreme Court case, there was a viewpoint that all these schemes are all right as far as they go, but it's also important to do something that goes a little bit further for protecting people's livelihoods. So right from the beginning in the initial petition, there was a demand for an Employment Guarantee Act, a little bit like the state of Maharashtra has had for a long time, since the early 1970s, whereby anyone who demands work can be employed on some local public work program within a certain time frame. In 2004, we had in fact the first national convention of the Right to Food campaign in Bhopal, and we decided to make that one of the core common demands of the entire campaign throughout the country. That was also the time when a new government came to power at the center, and by that time I should also explain that we had approached various political parties with all these demands related to the right to food and established a rapport with some of these parties. And as it happens, the Congress Party in its electoral manifesto in 2004 declared that they would enact an Employment Guarantee Act if they came to power, which of course nobody expected to happen. Even they didn't think, I think, that this would happen, but they did come to power as the leading party in the UPA coalition, the United Progressive Alliance coalition. And then after coming to power, they somehow decided, they had to build a common minimum program with other parties in that coalition, which became the roadmap of the new government. And the first item in that common minimum program was the Employment Guarantee Act. So it became a bit of a test of the credibility of that coalition government. And then there was a big campaign to make sure that the government actually implemented that promise. The government at that time also formed a new body called the National Advisory Council, which had 12 members and was chaired by Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, who was also the president of the Congress Party. So it had a fair amount of influence. And several persons who were closely associated with the Right to Food campaign were part of that National Advisory Council. For example, Aruna Roy from Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, and Dr. N.C. Saxena, who had been by that time appointed by the Supreme Court as a commissioner of the court to monitor the implementation of Supreme Court orders. I was also part of that council, and there were others. And the first issue that was discussed at the first meeting of the National Advisory Council was the Employment Guarantee Act. In fact, we had prepared a draft of the Employment Guarantee Act and we put it to the council. And after revising it, the council recommended it to the government, along, incidentally, with a draft of the Right to Information Act. So the government took that quite seriously. There was actually an attempt, there was a lot of opposition, of course, to the entire idea, and the government itself had cold feet for some time. They diluted this draft quite drastically, in fact, to the extent that they tried to pass an act according to which there would have been a guarantee of work, but only in those areas and at such times as the government decides, which is a complete joke, because it's like saying that I give you a guarantee of employment, but I don't guarantee that the guarantee will come into effect. So that would not have been satisfactory. So there was a whole public campaign to ensure that some basic safeguards were in the act, like universal guarantee throughout the country within a certain time frame, guaranteed payment of minimum wages, payment within 15 days, and so on and so forth. And most of these demands ultimately were conceded by the government, partly because by that time there was also a lot of pressure from the left parties to consolidate the Employment Guarantee Act. So in mid-2005, as a kind of culmination of this entire effort, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act came into force.
सभी पार्टी के नेताओं का, सभी माननीय सदस्यों का, सभी नेताओं का जिंदाबाद बोलते हुए मैं एक बार महोदय इस कविता के साथ कि आया रोजगार कानून आवे, बेकारी गरीबी मिट जाएगी, मानवता की काली बिंदी छार छार हो जाएगी। रोजगार गारंटी कानून जिंदाबाद। आप सभी से प्रार्थना है कि सर्वसम्मत से इस कानून, ऐतिहासिक कानून को पारित किया जाए, जिससे गरीबों के मन में उत्साह बढ़े, रोजगार मिले, पलायन रुके और हिंदुस्तान 2020 में दुनिया की अगली पंक्ति के देशों में चला जाए। यही सपना है। इन्हीं शब्दों के साथ आप सभी को विदा।
The question is that the bill as amended be passed. Those in favor may say aye. Aye. Those against may say no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. The motion is adopted and the bill as amended is passed.
The right to information, of course, is very crucial to all this. If I could say something, a few words about the sort of larger thinking behind this, at least as I see it. Of course, there are many different ways of thinking about these things. Now, the first thing that's important to me is that, in a sense, what is happening through these Supreme Court orders and the National Employment Guarantee Act and the Right to Information Act, and now with hopefully the Right to Food Act, because there's a talk of a Right to Food Act being implemented quite soon. It's a kind of revival of a vision that was very much at the heart of the Indian Constitution. In the Indian Constitution, there are two types of rights. There are the so-called fundamental rights, like the right to life, which are enforceable in court. And then there's a long list of economic and social rights, including the right to food, the right to health, the right to education, although that one has now become a fundamental right. But until recently, it was in that same list, which belong to what are called the directive principles of the Constitution. And Article 37 of the Constitution makes it clear that those rights are not per se enforceable in court. Like, you can't say, go to court and say, wait, I'm hungry, do something about it. But unless you invoke the right to life, of course, which is a fundamental right. But these directive principles are not otherwise enforceable in court. But the same Article 37 also says that these directive principles are fundamental to the governance of the country and have to be taken into account by the state in making laws. So there was a vision of making laws that would provide legal safeguards for these economic and social rights, or at least as much as possible, to as many aspects as possible of these economic and social rights. So the Supreme Court orders, for example, if we take the midday meal, the order on midday meals, which says that all the children who go to school can have a nutritious cooked midday meal every day at school. It's not the right to food, but it's an aspect of the right to food. It's an example of the possibility of putting in place legal entitlements, at least for some aspects of these, some very substantial aspects of these economic and social rights. So that is an important aspect of the thinking. The other thing is that the legal intervention is not the beginning or the end of. It's one form of intervention. And what is important to me in this campaign is that we use all the democratic means available, and there are many. You can intervene through the courts, you can go to political parties, you can sometimes influence public opinion through the media, you can do street action, you can do constructive action in the villages. All these are the possibilities that are given by Indian democracy. And again, any individual means of action will be inadequate, partly because of all the inequalities of the Indian society and the fact that all these tools of action are dominated by privileged classes. That applies in particular to the court or to the media, but still there is some democratic space that we can use to make a difference. So basically we use all these different means of action to revive that vision of putting in place legal entitlements for economic and social rights. So midday meals is in a sense the first example of that possibility in this particular context of food and work and survival and so on. The National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, I think, went very much further in that direction. I mean, that's really, to me, a prime example of the kind of legislation that can be passed with the aim of realizing these economic and social rights. The Right to Information Act, I think, can be seen in the same light. And in a sense, there's an overarching need for it, for all these other things to work, because one of the main arguments that were constantly invoked against all these interventions, and of course especially against the Employment Guarantee Act, was that it was useless because in any case these schemes don't work and the government is inefficient and there's a lot of corruption and all the money goes down the drain and so on and so forth. So it was very important to address that criticism and to do something to show that these schemes can actually work. And that's where the Right to Information Act really played a very, very important role, because it's a very, it again, a bit like the midday meals, it's a multi-purpose intervention, but in particular it's a very important tool against corruption. And that we have seen very clearly, for example, in the implementation of the Employment Guarantee Act, how the right to information, by making all the records public and transparent, can make it much harder to embezzle the funds. The right to information law in India is very, very strong. It's one of the strongest in the world. And basically it says that virtually any government document is in the public domain, and that anyone who requests a copy or who requests to see that record has to be given a copy within 30 days. And if that doesn't happen, then there are very strong penalties against the officials who are trying to hide information. All this, of course, applies with some exemptions, but the exceptions are very limited. It's items like defense and so on. And of course with also some safeguards for privacy, which are actually very important to balance the right to information. But it is a very strong law which makes it possible for any citizen to access virtually any public document. And in fact, it came, you're right to say that it has been used not only by the middle class or not only by journalists and so on, but by ordinary people from all kinds of social backgrounds. And in fact, that's where it came from. I mean, the right to information, at least as we know it today, came out essentially of Rajasthan, and interestingly in the context of these public works programs. So briefly what was happening at that time and what gave a bad name to these public works programs and therefore contributed to this opposition later on to the Employment Guarantee Act is the fact that there was a huge amount of embezzlement of people's wages. And the way that happens basically is that when you implement a local public work program in India, there's something called the muster roll, which is basically a kind of attendance register where the contractor or the implementing agency keeps a record of the names of the people who have worked and the number of days that they have worked and the amount of wages that is due to them. And that is used, it's a kind of attendance register, but it's also the receipt that you use to claim funds from the government after you have paid the workers. So the easiest way to divert money is to put fake names in the muster roll or to inflate the number of days that people are supposed to have worked, and then to claim more than what you're paying them, and you pay them what is their due, and you keep the difference. So that is the way huge amounts of funds were being siphoned off for a long time. And the reason why that was possible is that these muster rolls were completely beyond public scrutiny. It is unimaginable that a worker could go to the employer or to the implementing agency and say, I want to see the muster roll and I want to check whether the details against my name are correct.
सरकार की ओर से अल्पकालिक राहत कार्य चल रहे थे। वहां काम की उपलब्धता लोगों के हालातों पर नहीं, अधिकारियों, ठेकेदारों और प्रधानों की कृपा पर आधारित थे। लोगों से मनमाने ढंग से काम कराया जा रहा था और मजदूर शोषण का शिकार हो रहे थे।
मजदूरी कितना है
ये तो हमें जानकारी
नहीं है। आप ठेकेदार साहब, आप
नहीं, हमको जानकारी नहीं है।
आपको खुद पता नहीं है कि मजदूरी
हमको जानकारी नहीं है।
अच्छा,
हमको नहीं जानकारी नहीं है।
तो जानकारी होना चाहिए ना।
ठीक है, हमको यह जानकारी नहीं।
अच्छा, अगर आपको कहा जाएगा कि बिहार में न्यूनतम मजदूरी 64 रुपया है, लेकिन यहाँ मजदूरों को 50 रुपया मिलता है, तो इसका क्या किया जाए?
अब ये तो लोग लाता है, वो तो मेट इन लोग का अलग है, वो लाता है, हम लोग तो लाते नहीं है।
So now what has happened is that with the Right to Information Act, all these records are in the public domain, anyone can see them, and not only that, but they are being now proactively displayed on the internet. So you can just, by the click of a mouse, you can check how many people have worked in different villages, at what time, how much they have been paid, and so on and so forth. That obviously makes it much harder to fudge these muster rolls and to siphon off money. So that's an example of the power of the right to information in eliminating corruption. On top of that, now they're also paying the wages through bank accounts, which means that implementing agencies don't touch the money. So there are fairly strong safeguards now against corruption, and that has made it possible to implement the program.
India is a country of strong patriarch mentality. patriarchy is very strong in even though it's the largest democracy in the world.
I think that's a very important aspect. I mean, like the midday meals, the employment guarantee is a multi-purpose program, and that's the beauty of it. You know, many people think of it as just an income support program or protection against poverty, and of course that is the primary purpose, is to provide some form of social security in rural India. But it's also much more than that. And in particular, I think the angle of women's empowerment is very important. And over time, we are probably going to see a lot of interesting changes in gender relations in some parts of India because of this Employment Guarantee Act. Because in large parts of India, women are confined to the homes, or they perhaps work in their own fields, but they have no income, no independent income earning opportunities of their own, and therefore they have no resources. And this economic dependence of women on men is one of the major factors of gender inequality. Gender inequality in India is among the highest in the world, you know, whether you look at sex ratio or property rights or almost any indicator of gender inequality. The situation is really bad, especially in North India. And now in those areas where, you know, women have been dependent on men for centuries, for the first time they have a chance to go out of their homes, be employed as a worker in their own right, meet other women on the work site, earn their own wages, and also now they have their own bank account and they keep the money in their bank account. Now that, I think, will, you know, not just because of the money, but also because of going out, the socialization experience, also now taking part in the village councils because they have a stake, they have a new stake in participating in these community institutions. I think all this will bring a lot of interesting change. And there are other aspects also. There's the reduction of distress migration, there's the revival of community institutions, and of course there is the productive value of these works. I mean, many of these works are actually quite useful and could be even more useful with a little bit of technical and scientific inputs. So I think there's a lot of potential in all these respects, and that's why it's such an important program. Well, I think that's a very good question. The entire idea of this act, and for that matter the other entitlements that we have been pressing for, is that people will learn about their rights, and then they will put pressure on the system to have their entitlements, because they are the people who have a stake in the system working, and they are of course large numbers. So if they are aware of their rights and if they organize and press for it, it's much more likely to happen. Having said that, it's certainly true, as you say, that, you know, very often people are not very clear about their own rights. They may not even understand the notion of right, you know, because this is not the idea that you can hold the government accountable, that maybe you can even go to court against the state. It's completely alien to a large majority of people. But the whole advantage of having a law, or at least one advantage of having a law rather than just a temporary scheme, is that the law will stay. And it gives people time to learn about their rights and to develop awareness of them. And we are seeing that today. It's certainly true that the process is slow, and in some respects slower than I would have imagined, partly because, you know, not just that people can't read and write, but they may have a short attention span, they may forget, they may have lots of other things to think about and so on. It does take time, but nevertheless we are seeing a very definite increase in people's awareness. For example, the consciousness of minimum wages has dramatically risen in the last few years because of the Employment Guarantee Act. You know, the Minimum Wages Act goes back to 1948, but before the Employment Guarantee Act, firstly, it was never implemented, and most people didn't know what the minimum wage was, or most people didn't even know what a minimum wage was all about. But now if you talk to most energy workers, you will find that not only they understand the concept, but they know what the level of the minimum wage is. They watch it when it changes, when it increases, and so on. And also now they don't take less, and they are beginning to ask the same from the private employers. So this is that alone is, you know, it's a very interesting example of the kind of radical change that has already happened after the enactment of this law, and there are many other changes of that kind that can happen.
समझनी होगी कि 100 दिनों का रोजगार हमारा हक है। काम मांगना, काम ना मिलने पर बेरोजगारी भत्ता लेना, काम से संबंधित कागज निकलवाना, उनकी जांच करना।
मतलब ऑफिसर हमारे बाहर गए हुए हैं, ऑफिसर के आने पे सोमवार को हम रिकॉर्ड दे पाएंगे। सोमवार तारीख मतलब 6 तारीख। और जन सुनवाई करना हमारी जिम्मेदारी है।
आप जो बांसा में स्कूल बनी भी पर गया कि आप नहीं गया? आप उप स्वास्थ्य केंद्र बने हो बांसा में भी पर गया आप? हाँ नहीं गया। आप सामुदायिक केंद्र चबूतरा बने हो बांसा में भी पर गया? आपके नाम से 3155 रुपया उठाएड़ा है, लिया कि आप
मैं नीलिडा
That's right. I think that applies particularly in the case of the Employment Guarantee Act. Of course, for midday meals and so on, there wasn't any kind of violent opposition. But I think that the Employment Guarantee Act was very threatening for a lot of people. It was threatening, for example, for the corporate sector, partly because they always oppose government spending, unless, of course, it's something that benefits them, because it also goes against the grain of the sort of neoliberal reform and so on and so forth. Also because it means that they may have to pay higher wages to workers. That's one part of it, but more importantly, it was a very big threat to the nexus of people who were making money by cheating on these public works programs in the manner that I described earlier. And I think there, in that nexus, there are mainly three actors or three sets of actors. There are the contractors who used to be in charge of these public works programs, in charge of implementing these programs. And then, of course, the bureaucrats who were bribed by the contractors to get things moving or to keep their mouth shut or whatever. And then the politicians who were protecting the contractors and then asking for their share at the time of the electoral campaign. So the bureaucrat, politician, and contractor nexus was colluding to siphon off very large amounts of money from these public works programs. Now we are, with the Employment Guarantee Act, now there's a real effort to make a transition towards a transparent and accountable system where, first of all, the contractors are not allowed in the first place. The works are supposed to be implemented by the institutions of local governance, like the Gram Panchayats, the village councils, and all the records are in the public domain, and there are various safeguards against corruption, like the payment of wages through banks and so on and so forth. So that nexus was really threatened, and in fact in most states now it's gradually disappearing, and these contractors find other ways of making money. But there are states like Orissa, Jharkhand, Bihar, where this nexus of corruption and crime is very strong and is still trying to survive and still trying to defeat the transparency safeguards and to make money from this program. And these are the areas where there have been violent clashes of various kinds, including cases of people being murdered, for example, when there were social audits, and cases of people committing suicide because they were harassed by government officials and so on. So it is quite a worrying situation. And I think that in the medium term, the time I think is on the workers' side. I think that even in those areas that are most corrupt and criminalized, these contractors and their accomplices are finding it harder and harder to manipulate the system because there are so many safeguards. It's becoming too complicated and too much of a headache and too risky because now there's a beginning of taking action against people who are guilty of corruption, and so I think many of them are looking for other ways of making money. So I think time is on the side of the workers, but in between there could still be a lot of tensions. The two big arguments against the Employment Guarantee Act were, first of all, that it's a waste of money because there's so much corruption, and the other one was that it's too much money, we can't afford it anyway, even if it works. I have never been persuaded by that argument. I mean, we are talking of something like 1% of the Indian GDP. So we're redistributing 1% of GDP from the rich to the poor through this program. I certainly can't think of any convincing argument that makes that unreasonable if the program is working, which it is now in most states of India. In fact, I think that the Indian economy desperately needs a redistribution mechanism. It's been one of the fastest growing economies in the world now for quite a while. For almost 20 years, it's been growing really quite fast. But most of this newly created wealth, unfortunately, goes to privileged people. And because of that, the impact on poverty and on nutrition has been very limited. So I think there is a very important need for a tool of redistribution in the Indian economy. And I can't think of anything better than this employment program for that purpose. As it happens since 2004, the Indian economy has been growing really fast, except for this year because of the financial crisis. But until this year, it was growing really fast. And there has also been a substantial increase in the tax GDP ratio, with the result that the resources available to the government have increased very, very substantially. And that has made it possible to finance this program relatively easily, much more easily than people expected at the beginning. But in any case, I would say that for me, the financial argument, if anything, reinforces the case for having a law, because what you have to see this democracy where on the one hand there are all these democratic institutions that are working reasonably well, at least by international standards, but on the other hand there are these massive economic and social inequalities which have the effect that in spite of these democratic institutions, very little attention is being paid in the political system to people's basic needs, and that's why we still see so much poverty and so much hunger in India. About half of the Indian children are undernourished, which is one of the highest figures in the world, and that reflects this difficulty of getting the political classes to give priority to people's basic needs. And that's where a law can really make a big difference, because then once the law is there, there's no room for discussion. The government has to do what the law prescribes. So in the context of the financial resources, the fact that there are so many competing demands and that very often the money goes to the wrong programs that don't really help poor people, it actually strengthens the case for saying, no, now let's have a law and let's make sure that poor people get priority. There's a Right to Education Act, which has been languishing now for quite a few years, more than 5 years, although there's a hope that it may be passed quite soon. There was a law on forest rights which was passed a few years ago, which I think belongs to the same family of legislation, if you like, for economic and social rights, and was very important in giving forest dwellers right over the land that they had been, over which they had possession, but to which they didn't have any legal titles until then, and now they can claim that land as a matter of right. And of course now there's a discussion of a Right to Food Act being enacted, and I think that's a very, very important opportunity to consolidate many of these entitlements that we've been fighting for, and expand them, of course, and make them permanent, as opposed to depending on orders of the court, which are, at least in theory, interim orders.
See, this whole debate has become very extremely important for us, because it's not only a question of addressing hunger in terms of only the surviving, the giving the food, It's also the question of linking up the whole issue of the food and the rights and food security, and also, how with hold your access and all your control over it.
So there's a very big concern that how to not only protect your existing right to grow food, produce food, and have food sovereignty, to ensure that those policies are withdrawn, repealed. At the same time, to ensure basic food entitlements to everybody in form of subsidized food and for little children, even if there's food in the house, they may not be able to access it. So how do you ensure that kind of access? How do you ensure that the poorest of the poor, the primitive tribes, get the entitlement in emergency situations?
Laws don't solve intractable historical problems of injustice and inequality in themselves, but I think they're valuable because they place instruments in people's hands. It will give you instruments. You're not asking for charity. This is what the state's duties are, and you can demand it. While we must have this, the revolution or battles to change those larger structural causes, to change the system, in the meanwhile, there is an autonomous responsibility of society and of the state to ensure that no one sleeps hungry.
हम यहाँ आए हैं क्योंकि हम लोगों ने अपने हक के लिए इस सरकार को चयन भी किया, वोट भी दिया, तो इस आधार पे वोट दिया था कि ये गरीबों की मांग को पूरा करेंगे और साझा न्यूज